Well, good morning, South Fork. Excited to be back with you guys for the Friday edition of the Daily Read. Today we're in 2 Corinthians chapter 2. Second day in 2 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, if you're English and from Britain. That being said, let's jump right into it. So, 2 Corinthians 2, I think is best understood in the context of what 1 Corinthians brought in. So let's just kind of pause for a moment and remember 1 Corinthians was this letter that Paul wrote to a church that he had a previous relationship with. So he had helped start it and get it up and running, all these different things. And then he gets reports of some things going on in the church that weren't good. So division among the people, sexual immorality, people abusing kind of these remembrances of God. And the problem is that when he writes that letter, he was writing to them in a rebuke, of which some received it. But what we learn in 2 Corinthians is that some of them didn't receive it. Now, it's also important to understand that 2 Corinthians isn't the second letter to the Corinthians. What I mean by that is there were multiple letters written to them. This is just the second one that we have. So I think it's one of those things we have to sometimes pause and check our assumptions, right? And that's one of the biggest things I think we can do anytime that we study the scriptures is pause and check our assumptions. So the reality is, as human beings, anytime that we enter into a situation, anytime that we begin to read the Bible, anytime that we begin to listen to a story from one of our friends, we assume things. We are storytelling creatures. And what happens is that often works to our advantage, right? We're in a social situation. Let's use this example. We're in a social situation. Maybe we're in a crowded parking lot. And let's imagine an SUV, blacked out, dark windows tinted, the whole nine, comes zooming up forward. And all of a sudden, someone gets grabbed into the SUV and then hauled off. Assumption-wise, just from what I've told you there, you're putting together the story of what happened. So let's then take a look. What I assume that you assumed happened, and that I probably would assume would happen, is a kidnapping, right? Blacked out SUV pulls up in a crowded parking lot, grabs somebody, brings them in, boom, they're off. And so we assume, because of the things that we observed and because of our preconceived ideas about how things should and should not work in public, that was a kidnapping. When in all reality, what it might have been with the proper context is rather, let's say a family was heading to the emergency room, they had just got an emergency call, and the person in the parking lot that was kind of brought into the SUV really quickly, what appeared to you as kidnapping was actually they were trying to find the vehicle and where they had parked it, and their family was swinging by to pick them up real quick. Now, is that a terrible example? Probably. Could I have thought of a better one? Absolutely. But you get the point. The thing is that we, by the very nature of how God has wired us, are pattern-seeking creatures. Hence the reason when we come to a letter of the New Testament like 2 Corinthians, we can assume a lot about it that's not actually there. Part of that, again, just a review, is this is not the second letter to the Corinthians. This is actually way down the road in a series of communications that Paul has had. So what has happened between 1st and 2 Corinthians? Well, one, remember, a lot of the people were not appreciating who Paul was. They thought, well, this guy doesn't speak very well. He's not wealthy like we are. And so we're not going to think he has credibility. And so Paul goes to some painstaking detail of establishing his, so God sought reconciliation with us and our brokenness in relationship with him. And so really that's the model, whether it's pride or it's arrogance or it's just evil in general, takes over, then reconciliation is sometimes not possible. When someone is so hardened against the truth or against love, then reconciliation isn't possible. But what Paul's aim is here in verse 5 is to pursue reconciliation if possible. And so he says this, verse 5, "Now if anyone has caused pain, he has caused it not to me, but in some measure, not to put it too severely, to all of you." And what Paul is doing here is he's essentially saying that there are those in the church who have caused pain. They have aimed it at him, but it has actually been to the whole body. Now, what's important about this is if you'll actually remember back to 1 Corinthians, I believe it's chapter 5, where it talks about the guy who was just doing such crazy things sexually and immorality wise that even the people outside the church were like, yeah, that's nasty. remember what Paul's prescription was to them to treat this guy, to actually put him out, to remove him from the church because he was a danger to the people there. And so along those same lines, that's what Paul is saying here. He's saying, listen, this whole deal here where someone was trying to wound me, it actually wounded all of you as well. And so his prescription to them is in verse 6, for such one, this punishment by the majority is enough, so you should rather turn to forgive and comfort him, or may he be overwhelmed by excessive sorrow. The reality is that Paul's push for them is to pursue forgiveness of this person if they are willing to remain. And so really let that be an encouragement for your day. Here's the reality, guys. This is a pandemic, not a productivity test. This is a pandemic, not a way for us to begin to, I think, exercise judgment in the way that we would hold everyone to a perfect standard. That being said, there obviously is always sin present, pandemic or not. And so if we can begin to really front load as much grace as possible and as much as someone is willing to receive, then that can go a long way. Because the reality is that none of us have ever been through a pandemic before. Not a single one of us. Now, is that to excuse sin? Absolutely not. Is that to excuse abusive behavior? Absolutely not. But for minor things that aren't actually from ongoing long-term sin, whether maybe someone in your household right now is a little short with you because they're feeling stress, Paul's encouragement here would be, man, front load as much grace as possible. Now, again, I want to clarify, what I'm not saying is that this is somehow to excuse or turn you into a doormat for long-term abusive behavior or for long-term sin that someone's heart has been hardened against. But rather, the reality being that in everyday life, Paul recognizes in this second letter to the Corinthians that there are going to be ways that we rub each other the wrong way. And his encouragement for us would be to pursue forgiveness, to pursue front-loading as much grace as possible. Because in this life, the church has to be unified in order for us to be healthy. It doesn't mean unanimity. It doesn't mean that we all agree on the same thing, but it does mean that we realize that we're together in this so that we can be a blessing to those who are around us. So that being said, I love you guys. I hope you have a great rest of your day. I do want to encourage you to really think through, in what ways can I pursue forgiveness? In what ways can I begin to call people or text them and repent for things that I have done, that you have done, that we have done? Because I think really that power of seeking others' forgiveness is ultimately just a healing balm to the soul, especially when we can easily become hardened against people in our lives. Now again, caveat, this is not applying this to long-term abusive or manipulative behavior. This is saying, though, to the everyday and the mundane ways that we get on each other's nerves, let it be that we are known as a people of forgiveness. So that being said, love you guys. We'll see you on Monday. So no episodes, obviously, over the weekend. We'll see you on Monday with another episode of The Daily Read. I hope you guys have a great weekend. Just in experiencing, hopefully, some rest. So maybe time away from the news if you can. Just continue that social distancing. As far as Kentucky is going, we are starting to see some of the rewards of that, and just continue to pray for the comfort of those around us who are suffering in that. I think the reality is that none of us have escaped the pain that this whole virus, this pandemic is causing. Know that you're being prayed for, that you're loved, and that at the end of the day, we're going to make it through this together. God, I think, has just a tendency to turn all things from what was meant to destroy us into beauty. So that being said, love you guys. Have a great weekend, and we'll see you on Monday for the next episode of The Daily Read. Bye, guys.